For the first time since the summer of 2023, Ukraine is taking back more ground than Russia is capturing. Read that again. After nearly 4 years of a war in which every Western headline assumed the inevitable grinding advance of the Russian army, that advance has stopped. The Institute for the Study of War, the most cautious assessor in this conflict, confirmed it in black and white. Between February 14th and February 27th, 2026, Ukrainian forces achieved a net territorial gain of about 90 square kilometers. That is not a counteroffensive yet. That is something arguably more damaging to the Kremlin. It is proof that the myth is gone, the numbers no longer add up, and the war Vladimir Putin promised to win in 3 days has entered the phase every authoritarian leader fears most. The phase where the machine breaks faster than the men can rebuild it. And what you are about to see is not a single battlefield reversal. It is 4 converging collapses happening at the same time in the same quarter on the same shrinking map of Russian power. Let's start with what the numbers actually say, because this is where the Kremlin's spin meets arithmetic and loses. According to ISW data compiled by Russia Matters, Russia captured roughly 1,957 square miles of Ukrainian territory in the full year from March 2025 to March 2026. That sounds like a lot until you do the math. It equals about 0.8% of Ukraine's total territory of 233,062 square miles, less than 1%. Russia's average monthly gain across that 12-month window averaged around 170 square miles, about half the size of New York City, and came at a cost of nearly 250,000 Russian casualties, according to late February 2026 assessments shared with Russia Matters by a former high-ranking Western official who placed total Russian military casualties since February 2022 at roughly 1 million killed and wounded against an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 Ukrainian military casualties across the same period. After an entire year of the bloodiest fighting Europe has seen since 1945, Moscow has to buy every village in Donetsk or Zaporizhzhia with something closer to 1,000 dead per kilometer, and the rate is falling off a cliff. In the 4-week period from January 27th to February 24th, 2026, Russian gains dropped to an estimated 50 square miles. 50 for the entire Russian army. To put that in perspective, that is smaller than the city of Manchester, England, and Russia needed 4 weeks of offensive operations to take it. Meanwhile, in that same window, Ukrainian Army Chief Oleksandr Syrsky reported successful counterattacks around Huliapol in the Zaporizhzhia region, and President Volodymyr Zelensky said on March 3rd that Ukrainian forces had liberated 460 square kilometers since January 1st. The gap between the war Moscow claims it is fighting and the war Moscow is actually fighting has never been wider. ISW itself noted its own methodology probably underestimates Ukrainian advances because the analysts wait for open source confirmation before flipping territory back on the map. The front line, in their words, has become porous. Translation: Russia no longer controls what it claims to control, and Ukrainian units are moving through gaps Russian forces do not have the manpower to plug. ISW analysts were explicit. Ukraine's recent battlefield successes, they wrote in early March, have disrupted Russia's efforts to set conditions for a spring and summer 2026 offensive, forcing Russian troops to focus on establishing stable defenses before they can even think about retaking lost ground. Read that one more time. Russia is now on the defensive in sectors where it planned to attack. And that brings us to the second collapse, the one the Kremlin has been trying to hide since autumn: manpower. In the first 3 months of 2026 alone, the Russian army lost approximately 89,000 troops killed or seriously wounded. That figure comes directly from President Zelensky's end-of-quarter briefing, and it is backed up by analyst Janis Kluge's independent work using Russia's own finance ministry compensation data, which shows payments to the families of roughly 25,000 killed soldiers in the first quarter of 2026, up from 20,000 in Q1 of 2025 and only 10,000 in Q1 of 2024. The trajectory is straight up. In March 2026 alone, Ukrainian forces documented 35,351 Russian casualties, a single-month record matching December 2025. That is roughly 1,140 Russian soldiers killed or wounded every single day across every sector of the front. And here is where it gets existential for the Kremlin. Russia recruited only about 80,000 new contract soldiers in that same quarter against a 2026 target of 409,000. Moscow set a daily recruitment goal of between 1,100 and 1,150 signups per day. Actual average, according to analyst Maria Horyanova, as reported by LBC, has dropped to around 940 per day. More men are leaving the battlefield in body bags than are walking onto it in uniforms. That is not a recruitment slowdown. That is a mathematical death spiral. How is the Kremlin responding with the only tool an authoritarian state has left when cash and patriotism stop working? Coercion. Signing bonuses hit a record 1.47 million rubles, roughly 19,300 US dollars in March 2026. At least 12 Russian federal subjects raised their one-time sign-up payments by 50 to 80% since mid-February. Universities, according to multiple reports, have been ordered to ensure that a quota of students sign military contracts. Regional governors are pressuring businesses to nominate male employees for the front. Roughly 40% of new Russian personnel are now being drawn from what researchers politely call vulnerable population groups, prisoners, men, and severe debt migrants trading citizenship for a contract. And the foreign filler keeps coming. North Korean troops, Cuban nationals, Nepalese recruits, Central Asian laborers swapped into combat roles. None of this is the behavior of a confident military power. This is the behavior of a regime that has already burned through its first and second waves of volunteers and is now scraping the barrel with both hands while praying the political center holds. And here's the razor Putin is sitting on. If he keeps the current tempo, he runs out of replacements before Ukraine runs out of ammunition. If he orders a second mass mobilization like the one in September 2022, he triggers the exact political shock he has spent 3.5 years trying to avoid. The first partial mobilization sent 261,000 Russian men fleeing across the borders in a matter of weeks. A second one after 4 years of casualties would land in a society that already knows the cost. Kremlin watchers describe this as Putin's trap. No good move. Just slower versions of the same bad one. Quick pause before we get to the third collapse, and this is important because what comes next is the part the Kremlin genuinely cannot spin. If this kind of breakdown of Russian capability is the analysis you want to see more of, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We cover the stories other channels will not touch with sourcing from ISW, Reuters, Kyiv Post, and Western defense officials. Subscribe now and let's keep going, because the third collapse is happening inside Russia itself. For most of this war, Ukraine was the country being bombed. That has changed. Ukrainian long-range drones and cruise missiles have turned the tables on Russian critical infrastructure so completely that Reuters on March 25, 2026 called it the most severe oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. Roughly 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, about 2 million barrels per day, taken offline. The numbers are almost hard to process. Loadings at Primorsk and Ust-Luga, Russia's two largest Baltic ports, suspended after repeated drone strikes. The Black Sea port of Novorossiysk operating below schedule. The Druzhba pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia effectively halted since January due to damage inside Ukraine. Repeated seizures of Russia-linked Shadow Fleet tankers disrupting another 300,000 barrels per day of Arctic exports from Murmansk. And this is not a one-week spike. It is a sustained campaign that has forced the Russian government to reintroduce a ban on gasoline exports starting April 1st because the domestic market is being starved while producers chase whatever export dollars they can still move. The weapon at the center of this campaign did not exist 18 months ago. It is the Ukrainian FP-5 Flamingo developed by Firepoint, a domestic Ukrainian defense startup founded by civilians with no previous military-industrial background. The Flamingo carries a 1,150 kilogram warhead, or roughly 2,540 pounds, with an announced range of 3,000 kilometers, nearly 1,900 miles. That is double the unclassified range of the American Tomahawk Block 5, and the warhead is roughly 2.5 times heavier than a British Storm Shadow. The cost confirmed by Firepoint CEO Irina Turek is approximately 500,000 US dollars per unit, a fraction of the 1.5 to 2.5 million dollars per Tomahawk. Production is scaling toward 210 missiles per month at Ukrainian facilities, with solid rocket fuel now being manufactured in Denmark under a separate agreement. Alongside the Flamingo Ukraine fields, the Long Neptune, an evolved variant of the R-360 anti-ship missile, fitted with a 350 kilogram warhead and a range around 1,000 kilometers, using terrain-following flight and possible infrared terminal homing to slip under Russian radar. Together, these systems now come off Ukrainian production lines at roughly 40 to 50 Neptunes and around 90 Flamingos per month, according to Ukrainian defense reporting by Euromaidan Press. That is industrial-scale deep strike. That is Ukraine delivering from its own factories what 3 years of Western political hand-wringing over ATACMS and Taurus refused to deliver in the numbers that would have mattered. Now think about what these weapons are hitting: oil terminals, rare aircraft at Taganrog, including Russia's A-60 laser weapons testbed and the A-100 AWACS prototype destroyed in a combined Neptune and FP-2 drone strike. Satellite imagery released after that strike showed both aircraft destroyed, along with damage to the final assembly hall and a hangar used to modernize two 95MS bombers, the same bombers that launch Kinzhal-class cruise missiles against Ukrainian cities almost every night. FSB bases in occupied Crimea struck by Flamingo salvos. Ammunition depots near Kotluban and Volgograd Oblast reportedly hit on February 12, 2026, triggering what Ukrainian sources described as a series of secondary detonations of rocket artillery stockpiles. The Kapustin Yar test range, where Russia launches its Oreshnik ballistic missile, reportedly hit on February 8, 2026. This is not nuisance strikes anymore. This is deliberate methodical dismantling of the revenue pipeline that funds the war, the air defense network that protects it, and the prestige assets the Kremlin paraded on state television for 2 decades. Every tank farm that burns is gasoline the Russian army will not get. Every pumping station that goes offline is rubles that will not flow into the Kremlin budget, and Russia earns roughly a quarter of its entire state revenue from oil and gas, with some analysts placing the figure closer to 1/3. Cut 40% of that off for 2 weeks, and you cut the defense budget in ways no sanctions package ever managed. Russia has officially described these Ukrainian strikes as terrorist attacks, and has announced reinforced security across its energy infrastructure, but the geography of the campaign tells its own story. Primorsk on the Baltic, Ust-Luga on the Baltic, Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, Nizhny Novgorod inland, Oryol inland, Taganrog on the Sea of Azov. Ukraine is hitting at every compass bearing the Russian energy industry occupies. There is nowhere left to hide tanks that hold 2 million barrels per day of crude, which leads us directly into the 4th collapse, and honestly, this may be the most damaging of all: the collapse of Russian military prestige. Remember the narrative from February 2022, the number 2 military power in the world, tanks that would reach Kyiv in 48 hours, an air force that would achieve total dominance, a Black Sea fleet that would blockade the entire Ukrainian coast. 4 years later, look at what actually happened. The T-14 Armata, Russia's supposed next-generation main battle tank, has been completely absent from any serious combat deployment in Ukraine. Defense analysts widely assess the vehicle is still plagued by engine production and reliability problems the Russian defense industry cannot solve under wartime economic strain. The single brief appearance of an Armata near the front line back in 2023 was widely read as a publicity move, and since then the platform has essentially vanished from the battlefield. Russia has been fighting this war with the same T-72s and T-80s that rolled off Soviet-era assembly lines, supplemented by ever deeper withdrawals from long-term storage, some of which date back to the 1960s. The Black Sea Fleet has been pushed out of the Western Black Sea entirely. The flagship cruiser Moskva went down in April 2022 after being struck by Ukrainian-made Neptune anti-ship missiles, the same missile family that has now evolved into the long Neptune land attack variant hitting Russian soil. Kilo-class submarines damaged in port. Fleet headquarters hit at Sevastopol. The Russian Navy relocated major assets east to Novorossiysk because the water around Crimea is no longer safe for them. And the Su-57, the stealth fighter Moscow, marketed as a 5th-generation answer to the F-35, has been used so sparingly that every single combat loss or near loss causes a state media meltdown. Reports place Russia's operational Su-57 fleet in the single digits, with at least 2 lost or damaged in Ukrainian strikes on Russian airfields during the past 18 months. Compare that to what Ukraine looked like in February 2022, because this is the reversal that should keep Russian general staff officers awake at night. Ukraine in 2022 was dismissed as a weaker state with Soviet-era equipment totally dependent on Western donations, incapable of projecting force beyond its own borders. Ukraine in 2026 is domestically producing a 3,000-kilometer cruise missile for $500,000 apiece. Ukraine is running a deep strike campaign that has quadrupled in tempo over the past year, with roughly 45 confirmed strikes per month hitting targets between 50 and 250 kilometers inside Russian territory, according to Ukrainian open-source analysis cited by Al Jazeera. Ukraine is fielding upwards of 2,000 interceptor drones per day and has publicly offered to export half that production to Gulf states. The country that was supposed to collapse in 72 hours is now a net arms exporter in categories Russia cannot match. That is not a David and Goliath story anymore. That is a generational repositioning of who actually has dangerous industrial capacity in Eastern Europe, and the political dimension of all this is where it becomes truly historic. A Levada Center survey conducted February 18th to 25th, 2026, and released on March 3rd found that 67.2% of Russians now support opening peace negotiations, the highest figure Levada has ever recorded on that question. Support for continuing military action has fallen to 24.3%, the lowest figure ever recorded on that same question. These are not fringe dissidents. These are Russians being polled inside Russia under conditions of criminalized free speech on the war. When 2/3 of a population tells a pollster they want the war to end in a system where saying that can legally cost you jail time, you are looking at a ceiling Putin can no longer ignore. And while Putin's personal approval rating remains high in these surveys, it is propped up primarily by economic stability narratives and the classic rally around the flag effect. Historians of Russian authoritarianism will tell you exactly what happens when that stability narrative cracks and the casualty narrative arrives in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, where until now the Kremlin has carefully shielded the middle class from frontline losses. It has already begun. Kyiv Independent reported in early February 2026 that the share of ethnic Russians from major cities among the war dead is now rising sharply. The war is coming home in the one way authoritarian leaders fear most, not as headlines, as funerals. So what does all of this add up to? It adds up to a Russia that has lost its strategic initiative on the ground, its revenue stream at sea, its manpower math on paper, and its prestige narrative on every screen that matters. Putin is now trapped between two doors. Behind door 1 is continued attritional war at current tempo, which the numbers say he cannot sustain past 2026 without collapse. Behind door 2 is full mobilization, which the Levada numbers say he cannot survive politically. Both doors lead to the same room, a room where Russia's leverage at any future negotiating table shrinks every single week. Think about what that means for the peace talks that have dragged through Abu Dhabi, Geneva, and Miami over the past year without any real breakthrough on Eastern territory or NATO pathway questions. Every additional week of oil infrastructure damage, every additional month where casualties outpace recruitment, every additional quarter where Ukrainian industry scales and Russian industry degrades tilts the eventual deal further against Moscow. The longer Putin stalls, the worse his offer gets. That is the opposite of the strategic logic he thought he was operating under when this war began. The Kremlin spent 4 years telling its population this would be quick, then cheap, then manageable, then strategically necessary. What it cannot tell them now is what comes next. Because the Ukrainian drones are still flying, the Flamingo production lines are still scaling the ISW maps, are still quietly flipping territory back, and the Russian finance ministry is still paying out death compensations faster than the recruitment offices can sign contracts. This is what strategic defeat looks like in slow motion. Not a single battle lost. 100 small ones lost at the same time on every front that actually matters. The Russian army is not going to break in a single day. It is going to break the way all overextended armies have broken throughout history. Quietly on a Tuesday somewhere, nobody was paying attention when the next unit ordered forward simply does not exist on the roster anymore. If you want to see how Ukraine's drone industry built this capability from scratch in under 4 years, check out our deep dive on the Flamingo production program linked on the card above. And for our full breakdown of why the Russian Black Sea Fleet will never recover, the video is in the description. Subscribe, hit the bell, and we will see you on the next one.